Right. Hi, everybody. Welcome. Thank you very much for braving the delightful weather and coming along. I need to welcome you a little formally to this it's a dual event. This is both a Department of Development Studies seminar series event, and at the same time, it's what we call a DLD conversation. So DLD is called Development Leadership Dialogue, and it's a little institute based here at SOAS that I run together with Hajun Chung and my colleague. Hajun can't be with us, but Jonathan DeJohn, my other colleague and co-director, can be. So it's a pleasure to welcome you all and to people online as well. It's also a pleasure and a great honor to welcome my guests, our guests, this afternoon. And our guests embody really what we try to do in DLD, insofar as what we try to do is bring people together around issues, people from different sectors and backgrounds, perspectives and disciplines. So what we've got here this afternoon is really, really fantastic. We have Jeremy Adelman, who is a historian, an economic historian primarily, a professor at the University of Cambridge, who runs something very, very interesting also called the Global History Lab. But the main reason that Jeremy is with us today is he wrote a really quite magnificent biography of Albert Hirschman. So we will be starting with Jeremy shortly. We also have my old friend and an emeritus professor of economics at SOAS, John Sender, who is not a historian, but is interested in history. He's an economist. Like Hirschman, he takes interdisciplinarity seriously. And like Albert Hirschman, and unlike many economists, he gets his boots dirty. He goes and observes things. He likes to spend time in rural areas observing closely and so on. And then we're also joined by Professor Akebe Okubai, who's a British Academy Global Research Professor here at SOAS. So you might think, another academic. Well, he is. He's a scholar, but he's also, if you don't know this by now, has a very, very rich, long experience, which among other things includes being a senior policy official in Ethiopia, where he was a senior advisor to 3 prime ministers in a row. The CV goes on too long, but one thing he was chair of the governing board of Ethiopian Airlines. And I say that partly because it just gives me an excuse to point you to our little case studies, one of which is on Ethiopian Airlines. So you're welcome to look at our stuff down there at the front. But I don't want to go on too long by way of introduction. What I do want to say is when I teach Albert Hirschman myself, which I do once a year to undergrads here at SOAS, I think, how can I get them interested in Albert Hirschman? They've never heard of this character. And so what I say is that unlike anybody else on their reading list, Albert Hirschman is one of the main characters in a Netflix series. It's a really dreadful Netflix series, but it's quite entertaining. It's called The Transatlantic, if you don't know it. If you can stomach some of it, it's actually quite funny in a sort of slightly unintended way in various ways. But Hirschman was, and it's a very, very serious history that series is about. It's worth getting to know more about, and maybe it'll come up in our conversation. But because of that, there are a number of more serious reasons why I think Hirschman remains of relevance to us in a very, very complicated and turbulent world. But you're here to hear that from them, not from me. So I'm going to hand over to Jeremy, who'll talk for 15, 20 minutes, and then each of our other guests a little bit shorter, and then we'll take it from there. So Jeremy, Great. If I can hand to you.
So should I?
You have to be here.
I have
for the online people.
Right, of course.
Sorry about that.
Okay, no worries.
And you can use this.
Okay. Thank you. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. It's great to be back at SOAS. I was a postgraduate student here many years ago, studying Japanese economic history. So it's much bigger than it used to be back in the 1980s. It's great to be back also talking about Albert Hirschman, because the book is now it's a vintage, 2013, I think. And I've moved on to other projects and books. But Hirschman, he's the kind of person I've been reading all my life and thinking through and about all my life. So the opportunity the convoking us all together really brought him out of the shadows of my brain to the forefront. So here's some ideas from the book, but also, years later, what do I think? I can't just, my vanity has got the better of me. I think it's easier without the glasses. This is the man. So this is a photograph taken in the early 1960s in Colombia. And by the photographer is Hernan Diaz. And the place of Colombia in his thinking is going to be very important. And the word observation has already come up. I think we'll probably talk about what it means to observe the world over and over again. But what I thought I would do just to lay the groundwork is to do a little bit of a sketch of a life, but really focus on, in that life, the making of a style or the features of a style of thinking about development. And what those components are, because he had a very distinctive intellectual style. Of course, born in Germany in 1915, was part of the left resistance against the rise of fascism, fought in the Spanish Civil War, fought in the French army. In fact, I think I have an image from the French army up here. When the Nazis invaded France, he then was in the Italian resistance. I can go on. And then joined the American army when he finally fled and was on the Italian campaign. He was, for the first, let's say, 1/3 of his life, a committed anti-fascist. And his thinking about the economy, in the middle of all of which he got a PhD in economics, was embedded within that ethical question about democracy and open societies. I'm going to come back to that in just a minute. But all of that, that voyage and the experiences that he had in multiple exiles, whether it was exile in France, exile in the United States, exile in Colombia because he's driven out of the United States during the McCarthy purges, created a composite character with a particular style. I think, so a few general comments, and then I'll go into 4 signatures. So one is that as you read Hirschman, think about his quite singular ability to render complex lives, and the human life was always central to story, and processes in simple parables or explanations. He was an aphorist, and when you read him, think about his effort to try to take complexity and boil it down. I'll come back to the complexity question in just a minute. The second very general feature to think about is that he was a figure who never saw the social sciences. I think this will also come up over and over again, as somehow separate from world affairs. That what was happening in the world needed to inform his style of social science, and vice versa, that you take your concepts and you test them in the world with the people that you care, and in some cases don't care very much about. So all of his analytical tools, we'll talk about them, were embedded historically. What that meant was twofold. One, that our concepts were always historically contingent. They were the products of history. They didn't float above them, which is sort of what social science mainstream often takes as a precept. And the second is that the knowledge that he was committed to producing on his own and with colleagues was meant to expand the range of possibilities or alternatives to the experience of the social sciences in the world. In a way, and here's a metaphor that he used not long after this photograph was taken, that in a sense his idea of social science was to hold up a lantern to a dark world and illuminate the role of the imagination for social change, which was very important for a creature, a person who was the product of very dark times in European and, in fact, in Latin American history. So 4 styles, elements of his style to think about. So I'm going to talk less about particular publications, although I might reference them, than elements that I think run through the entire oeuvre. So the first style was to be skeptical. There we go, the skeptic. From his early sort of, I'll use occasionally the Spanish formación as a political economist, as a member of the Social Democratic Party in Germany. He learned economics. He read his Wealth of Nations alongside Marx. And in fact, his whole entourage, his sister, we were talking about it, his sister was a member of the Communist Party. Marxism really stamped him early on, though he was a skeptic of Marxism, when it was the orthodoxy for much of the left. So his 1930s struggle against Marxist verities was very important as a motivator, while at the same time being sympathetic as a kind of man of the left, but an anti-Marxist. By the 1950s, he's a skeptic of planning. When planning was the orthodoxy, he was always questioning the pseudo-certainties of the grand planners of the 50s and 60s. And so this image is of a Christmas card that the family sent when they were living in Colombia in the 1950s, after fleeing the United States in late 1951. They wind up in Colombia. Those years from 51 to 57 were very important for Hirschman's development as a development economist. He had not really been trained in development economics. Development economics sort of didn't really exist when he was being educated. But the Christmas card, which was done by another exile, it was a Hungarian exile in Bogota, the Christmas card they sent out to friends this is Albert Hirschman at the top of the banana tree. He's an agrarian consultant. And excellent food is the banana. Let's eat it today and plan it mañana. So the plan was really not where the action was. That was the orthodoxy of all the world bankers and others who were coming down and telling Colombians, follow our pre-designed script for your history, right? Which he felt obliged to dissent from. And of course, by the 1970s, he becomes one of the important voices as a skeptic of market fundamentalism, and writes an important book called The Passions and the Interests, which goes back into Adam Smith and looks at some of the early thinkings about capitalism in the 18th century to find that some of the precepts around market fundamentalism are not encoded in their Bibles. So he's a skeptic about grand claims. I think we're going to come back to that style. Second, he was an observer. This too has come up. I think we'll come back to it. Colombia, as I said, was very important to him. So the picture on the right is he's doing some work also as an advisor, a freelance consultant on some agrarian reform projects in the Llanos area of Colombia. This is with his wife, Sarah. And on the left, that's a picture of him here. Sorry, microphone. That's him, that's Sarah. Again, that photograph is taken in 1964, early 65, as he's doing important work for the World Bank. The World Bank at that juncture had been invested in development projects from the late 1940s onwards. And the brass at the World Bank were very concerned that they'd been pouring money into projects, but no one was ever looking at them. No one was ever observing them and thinking about what the effects were. They sort of assumed that the investments were being made and that the returns were being harvested. And he made the case for doing what we now take for granted, it's almost like an project evaluation. That is, observe what you're doing as you're doing it and take lessons. Among other things, to pay attention to the side effects of the project itself that aren't necessarily bottled in the original the design of the plan itself. So unintended consequences were extremely important for him. And sometimes the unintended consequences of a project were more important than the intended ones, which meant that you had to have an open, what he called an Oakman cognitive style, and an observational commitment to figure out what was happening on the ground. I think we'll come back to that over and over again. So on projects and their human events, so notice, for instance, he does not like the plans, but he likes projects. Okay, he's very interested in it, and the semantics matter a lot to him. And part of the trap of big plans and not observing what you're doing, including the unintended, was the fallacy that the expert social scientists had in their ability to command a complete sense of what would happen in the world as a result of their intervention. So he was skeptical of grand theories, starting from Marx all the way to market fundamentalists. And the way to get around that was through this experimental observational style. That was also therefore self-reflexive. So you take the knowledge that you get from observing the effects of what you're producing in the world to revisit your concepts. But late in his life, some people would complain that he then would often go back to his own concepts, and it felt to some readers as if he was a narcissist, and he was a narcissist. Most academics are. But it had an epistemological purpose, which was to go back and revisit your assumptions in light of what you see, those things that your ideas have an effect on. Okay, so that's number two. So number one was the skeptic. Number two is the observer. I'll just one small little thing on projects that he really was important to think about is that projects put pressures on decision makers. He always felt that in the development process, what was most scarce, and in this sense, he was a critic throughout his life of an idea that we all used to, I don't know if this is what people read anymore, that capital scarcity was the real obstacle to development in the so-called third world. This is back when I was a postgraduate student. That's not capital that's scarce, it's decision-making capabilities. And what projects do is put pressure on people to make decisions and to develop their own cognitive capabilities to do these sorts of things. So that's why they were important, because they produced an internal and external disequilibrium. And the instability was very important. This brings me to the third of his style, which was he believed in disruptions. Producing disequilibria that forced you to think in new ways about what was happening in the world. Don't look for the equilibrium. That was also happened to dovetail with this idea that thinking that you had all the knowledge, this panoptic view of the world, and you could synthesize it into a plan and put it into place. And if there was any failure or deviation from the plan, it had something to do with implementation. Does that sound familiar? And not with the plan itself. So he believed in disequilibrium and disturbing systems. And this is why and it comes back to complexity, rather than looking for certainties in the social sciences, he was looking for the ability to capture complexities, anomalies, contradictions. So his vocabulary, when you read him, is very different from the vocabulary of what was becoming by the 1960s and mainstream economic thinking. In fact, a lot of his essays on methodology have to do with this. Development had to be seen as, by definition, disruptive. And that was not a problem, or could be a problem. And in fact, he was often accused of supporting macroeconomic policies that were inflationary. But what he really meant by this was that you had to create disruptive effects on the choke points that prevented development from working, to force this decision-making into being. So these two images, microphone. This is Albert in New York writing The Strategy of Economic Development. And the photograph on the left is taken in Chile in the mid-1980s. And the graph behind him, if I had a chalkboard, we don't use those anymore, I would draw it for you. It's a graph he drew about the differences between different models of development over time. One is an adversarial model in which you swing towards import substitution industrialization, which was a term that he coined, versus export-oriented growth, and Latin America as having followed a very dramatic zigzagging pattern between these two models of development. And he was trying to capture in this master narrative what were the development lessons from this particular kind of experience. But putting an accent at the core at the disruptive effects of the policies that Latin American countries have put into place. So that's the third, is thinking about disequilibria and disruption to systems as a fertile source of ideas and inspiration, rather than the problem that you had to always eliminate. Last, this has also come up. And this is the photograph taken in Marseille. So if you see the transit, like, we didn't plan this at all, but if you see the Netflix series, which is hilarious, there are actually a couple scenes, and the director of the series did contact me about some of the images that I'd used in the book, because she tried to reconstruct some of these scenes for the series, in spite of all the liberties that she was taking and what really was going on. So this is Albert working with a refugee scholar who's trying to get out of Marseille in late 1940 after the fall of France. And so even as this was a young economist, and we can go into details about what he was doing in the midst of the beginning of the hecatomb of the Second World War. He always felt that the human face of the social science was really important as an ethical commitment. That social scientists were not separated from the world that made them, and that there was really not such a thing as an impartial social science. It didn't bother him that you could be partial, and that there were commitments at stake. And for Hirschman, it was about democracy and open societies. And one of the takeaways from that, and this is why I've been focusing a lot on the words, in fact, the World Bank review project that I mentioned, the report that comes out of it is Development Projects Observed, is his concern with the use of language in democracy. And on this point, I'll just end. And his concern was with what he called intransigence. The intransigence being the commitment to the idea that you can't be wrong, that anything that is wrong with your theory comes from outside the theory itself. So he was not an optimist or a pessimist. He was a category of a term that he borrowed from Kierkegaard, a possibilist. But the condition for the possibilist was not to trap oneself into one's present, not to trap oneself into, or rather to embrace the possibility that one might be wrong, and use that as an opportunity to look at the world afresh every time you stepped out the door and got involved in the development experience. Thanks.
That's just brilliant. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeremy. It just strikes me that both our other guests are skeptics, they're ethicists, they're observers, and they're disruptors. So John, come and don't disrupt too much, but.
Well, I think it would sort of in keeping with the occasion if I trespass. I'm going to trespass, and I feel sort of a little bit of an imposter faced with the most eminent biographer of Albert Hirschman, but I'm going to talk a little bit about his biography, trespassing out of my field of economics into a field with which I am completely unfamiliar. But you'll forgive me. I'll begin with a very nice Jewish boy.
Yeah.
In upper middle class Berlin. Albert Hirschman, actually Otto Albert Hirschman, aged 9 years old. And it's only through luck, accident, ethical commitment, unintended consequences that we get to the next picture of him, which Jeremy's already referred to a little bit, which is the man who, as a teenager, was a member of the left splinter group of the SPD in Germany, ran away to France, worked in the resistance, anti-fascist resistance in Trieste, fought in the Spanish Civil War, rescued many people working as part of the French resistance. And there's his forged card of identity. He was quite a good forger, I think, and that he used when he was smuggling refugees out of France across the Pyrenees. I think that highlights, if you like, how one can't make assumptions that there are smooth paths from one to the other. Who would have thought that this character would become the distinguished professor in Columbia, in Yale, and in Harvard, and in Princeton, and at California, and funded by the Rockefeller Foundation, and working for the World Bank? This sort of character doesn't look like a likely person to reach those positions. And I think that's a nice, if you like, Hirschman-esque approach to the issue of what one can say about Hirschman. I'm going to focus on a much more narrow topic from now on. That's the end of my trespassing. I'm going to ask why Hirschman's ideas should be considered important now. And I'm going to focus on what he wrote about decisions to invest in projects and large-scale projects, infrastructure projects, and what one can say about cost-benefit analysis if you look at Hirschman. Those are going to be my themes. Why is it relevant now? Well, infrastructure investment, as you know, if you look at Angola and other parts of Africa, and indeed Latin America, has become a political tool of great importance. And indeed has become of great importance not only in Africa and Latin America, but in America too. It's a political project which, as the last Biden big budgetary push of trillions on infrastructure points out. Global infrastructure data suggests not only is the rate of investment, public's investment in infrastructure and total investment in infrastructure accelerating remarkably globally, but each of the projects are getting bigger and bigger. The mix is changing towards bigger projects. So if we look at what the latest data seem to show, these are the figures on the left. You may not be able to see them. I can't understand them anyway, because they're trillions of dollars. And that's just sort of very hard to get your head around. But you can see which way it's going and how it has begun to accelerate. How do economists look at infrastructural investment? Well, I think the first thing to do is to say that almost universally, they look at them much more negatively and pessimistically than Hirschman ever would. They say they're systematically over-optimistic about costs. or over-optimistic about benefits and pessimistic about costs. They get it wrong over and over and again. Over budget, over time, over and over. Quite apart from the disaster that all these large-scale infrastructure projects in developing countries cause for human beings, for ecological environment, and for the poor, because these projects are universally disastrous in the sense they make poor people worse off and rich people better off. So over and over, they're pretty bad, big projects. And it's part of a broader impossibilism. We've had the phrase possibilism suggested to us, part of a broader impossibilism in development economics. From Harvard, we have Danny Roderick, who basically says developing countries don't have much chance of industrializing anymore. They missed the boat. East Asia got there first, and it's not going to happen. A survey of irrigation projects in Africa by Kikuchi argues that there are inherent problems which are impossible to avoid, what he actually calls the malevolent hiding hand. It's not possible to avoid it in African irrigation projects. He's got some quite interesting arguments as to why he thinks that's the case, but I'm not going to go into those now. This is a quote from Roderick. I come down on the pessimistic side due to what I think are the poor prospects for industrialization. States should really not do much. They should facilitate development rather than intervene. And the sort of interventions they make should be matched to the low levels of capacity that exist in poor economies. And also, again, going to Harvard, where you have the poverty lab and the complexity analysis, they should basically stick to the sort of things they've always stuck to, that they have a comparative advantage in. So we've got Hausman, Hidalgo, and Roderick. It's a form of pessimism. Do what you can do, don't do anything else. Don't bite off more than you can chew. Hirschman has a fundamentally different perspective, and I think that's really my main message, and certainly the message that Jeremy was making. The drive for certainty in project planning leads to pseudo-insights, leads to bogus scientific analyses. What you need to do instead is to adopt the methods of, which I think Hirschman learned from his wife, who was heavily influenced by his wife, as well as discussions with Clifford Geertz later in his life at Princeton, were the methods of social anthropologists, methods of thick description, of understanding in detail local contexts. That's how you could begin to... Hirschman poses the question, which I like: how will a country ever learn about technology if it does not tackle technologically complex and problem-rich tasks? In his reasoning, as an unfitness of the project for a country, and we speak here about Ethiopian Airlines, as if Ethiopia should have the most successful airline in the world in some years. It's unfit. That's the sort of story Hirschman liked, I think. Unfitness of the project for a country becomes an additional strong argument for undertaking it. The unintended, and I'm repeating Jeremy, the unintended leads to creativity. And it leads to a learning of how to make decisions, and the ability to make decisions about investment, again, I'm afraid I'm quoting Jeremy, is the most difficult and scarce thing in poor countries. Unfortunately, cost-benefit analysis and other techniques by mainstream economists for maximizing returns to an imagined scarcity of capital or techniques which allow you to rank projects very precisely in order of their net returns, what Hirschman called pseudoscience. Those are what mainstream economists do and what they recommend. And to the extent that they acknowledge that some projects have failed, it's because they weren't done enough. Now, the line which I drew you with the trillions suggests that mega projects are not going away. They're going to be with us for a long time. Who knows when the high-speed link to the north of England will ever end. Don't pretend that there won't be crises, that there won't be things that you didn't anticipate. Acknowledge the fact that there will be, and they will trespass. Look very closely at the local context of particular projects and spend much, much more time than economists ever dream of in monitoring an ongoing project as a basis for changing the decisions you first made.
Lovely. Thank you very much, John. We will come back to some of those issues, I think. I just briefly want to say about Achebe, that Achebe did tackle big, complex projects, so it has that kind of experience. And Achebe has that decision-making capacity that I, for one, don't have, I must say. And I've seen this. He can't help himself. I hope you'll forgive me for saying this, but when Achebe was doing his PhD, he would go from here, from SOAS to Ethiopia, and he would go to interview people at the airport or at factories or wherever, and he would tell me these stories that I'd hear about, that he would go there and he was observing and observing and observing, and instead of only being the PhD researcher asking questions, he kind of told them, you have to change things this way and that way. And so whilst he was doing the PhD, he was also doing the technological complex and the decision making. So Achebe, why don't you come and tell us a little bit more from your perspective? Thank you.
Thank you, Chris, for organizing this beautiful discussion. Jeremy, you could see I'm a SOAS alumni, and you could see the whole conference hall full of participants. I was actually doubting, will the turnout be high? And it's now quite full. So at SOAS, I can say about Hirschman has been part of the lessons and lectures in especially political economy of development by Jonathan, Chris, and many others. And my, by the way, your book was extraordinary, timely book, which combines both the autobiography, but also selected essays of Hirschman. And I have 2 copies. And the reason was I bought online when it was released, and then 2 friends brought me a signed copy, John and Chris, to add. So I have 2 copies. I can say one of the most foundational economists that had really influenced my thinking is Hirschman. When I read the first time his books, it didn't give me any sense. And I had to read it 3 times, 4 times. And for my PhD, it was a very, very important lens to do my PhD research. And the more I read, after, let's say, few years, I still dig and understand his ideas. So what makes Hirschman's ideas quite unique? The first one is its originality, very unconventional. You can start from his basic theory of the unbalanced development. At that time, this debate was quite conceptual, quite abstract and theoretical. But when we bring it with reality, is a very, very important, powerful thing, because one of the key concepts that Hirschman has been underlining is there is no precondition for development, for growth. No, institution is not a precondition. And development, you need it not because you have resources. You need it because you don't have the resources, but you have scattered, unutilized resources you can really build over it. So one is the originality and unconventionality. One of the unique terms, which is one interesting, is the import swallowing concept. Import swallowing, which is he tried to elaborate in his important article, which Jeremy mentioned, the the import substitution industrialization in Latin America. He brought the concept of import swallowing. If you want to promote export, you don't just start from export. You have to build demand. And one way of building the demands could be encouraging more imports. And the more imports raises the quantity, the demand, then it creates the need for exporters to make investment for domestic market as well as exports. So the import swallowing, I have never heard this term anywhere or debated by other economists. Then the point which Jeremy highlighted, the observation, is quite important. If we look at all his books, he doesn't start from theory. He starts from observation and try to develop some hypothesis, which we can call inductionist research methodology, which makes it quite powerful. Having said this, I want to touch 2-3 examples as well, because my background is linked with practice, with policy making. Hirschman's thought was quite useful for me. I try to see from that lens. And one of the elements that was basic by the way, from his first book, The Strategy of Economic Development, which is well known, everyone refers. I enjoyed the books which he wrote later on, Development Projects Observed, which Jeremy mentioned, was based on his observation of 11 or 12 World Bank projects. And actually, one of the projects was the Imperial Telecommunication Authority of Ethiopia. That was part of his observation. Another one was in Nigeria. At least these were two from Africa. So one of the concepts he put is what he calls the law of hiding hand. You start a project. When you do the project, you do feasibility study, you do all type of studies. But when it comes to actual implementation, I have never seen any project unfolding as it was planned. New challenges emerge, new difficulties. But all these difficulties are learning processes. You try to address them because this is a project politically very sensitive. You have to find solution. If it fails, the damage is quite significant. So it unleashes a lot of potential which has not been released earlier. So in his law of hiding hand, he says that we underestimate the challenges when we plan. But also there is underutilized or unforeseen creative power also that gets released during the implementation of the project. And this is quite absolutely important in all policymaking processes. The second area he highlights relevant in policymaking is the latitude for performance. This also is in his development projects observed. And his concept was there are some industries, he said, third world countries or developing countries have better competitive advantage over aviation than garments or apparel sector. And the point he said is some industries will force you to learn, to discipline. And there is a narrow latitude for performance. If you fail, there is no room for learning. So this is where the Ethiopian Airlines story comes. Ethiopian Airlines started from scratch in 1945. And it was Emperor Haile Selassie who initiated that project. He went to Americans and assisted assistance. And when this Ethiopian Airlines was launched, which is now 4 times the size of Virgin Atlantic, with about $8 billion turnover. And at that time, there was no a single technician in Ethiopia at all. No airport at all. No pilot at all. And even the cabin crew were all Americans. This is linked with the concept of Hirschman. You don't start projects because you have the resources. The projects themselves are the way you develop your resources. And then John mentioned an important point about mega projects, which is also quite useful. And such mega projects, the benefit is you aim, and if you don't try to practice with bigger programs and you only do less risky projects, you are not going to learn much more. And this is relevant in every project or development programs. And for me, one example from Africa will be the Grand Renaissance Dam in Ethiopia, which was built entirely from zero assistance, international assistance, entirely mobilized from local. And the reason for that was not because Ethiopia chose to mobilize local resources. One important reason was all international organizations and financial institutions, including bilateral partners like China, all were not willing to put any money on this project because of the geopolitical sensitivity. And the government was left with no option. And the only option was to mobilize everyone to mobilize the resources needed for it, which has been now been completed, the biggest hydropower project generating over 5,200 megawatt. And this project, when we look at actual implementation, it didn't go as it was planned. The plan was to complete in 6-7 years. It took about 14 years. Actually, the budget was manageable within that plan, but a lot of new lessons and new ideas had to come. So one of the tradition in Ethiopia has been taking major projects, very ambitious projects, and not fearing that it can fail. So we had a successful housing program in Addis Ababa in 2003, when I was the mayor of Addis Ababa. Then we decided to expand it, to scale up in 35 cities. Then while we're in this implementation, we expanded it to 65. So the entire housing development project was being implemented in 65 towns. And then it became very challenging. We tested it, then there was not much demand in many cities, and the construction capability was also limited. And we had to and the macroeconomic effect was also, we were able to observe it. And we decided to cancel 63 cities housing development program without hesitation. And we only continued in 2 cities, especially in Addis Ababa. So the key point is your development programs are actually full of tensions, full of imbalances. And a critical element in all these processes is the linkage effect. Linkage effect is a very powerful concept that, in particular, industrial policy, you try to select sectors that are so powerful in terms of linkages. But linkages also change in the process. The direction of linkage also changes in the process. So I'm trying to bring these examples that the Hirschman's ideas were not abstract, and they are very, very important even for the 21st century now, not just 50, 60 years ago. And Jeremy did an excellent job bringing that book, which is now available, because when I was doing my PhD, Hirschman's books were not even available on Amazon. And you will find all published books secondhand costing quite high. So I was able only to read in in the library. But your book is now widely available, and then you have really done excellent job, and congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you, Akabi. I'm tempted to say this conversation is brought to you by Ethiopian Airlines. Sorry about that. Jeremy mentioned something about intransigence. So you've all been good enough to come out, and some people logging on online. So I want to give you all a chance to ask them some questions, but I'm just going to hog the mic for a moment, because there's something to do with intransigence that's always appealed to me about Hirschman. And it's this: it's that he shared this with his brother-in-law and friend, Eugenio Coloni, this idea that they had a phrase for it, which is proving Hamlet wrong. What does that mean? So the idea is that, well, Hamlet is all about how doubt stops you in your tracks. It prevents you from actually taking a decision and doing anything. And for them, in a very, very polarized and challenging time of the world, doubt, intellectual openness and doubt wasn't something that stopped you from doing anything. It was exactly what motivated you to take decisive, and actually in that case quite dangerous, political action in a context of increasing unfreedom and so on. So I thought, there's a certain amount of polarization in our world intellectually, and there's a certain amount of encouragement to believe in one intellectual certainty or another. And so I wondered about whether all three of you might have something to say about the significance, the role of doubt and intellectual openness, either in his work, your careers, the world out there, whatever. Can I put that to you? Anybody who wants to stab at that? Jeremy?
Maybe start out with a very macro issue around, let's say, the fertility of doubt. Rather than paralyzing you, which is for Hamlet, it can release you. You don't have to know everything with the illusion that eliminating doubt will eliminate risk. You don't have to know everything before acting, and in fact, acting can often produce knowledge that you wouldn't otherwise have access to. That's the virtuous circle when it works. It doesn't always work. But the one macro way of thinking about it is, and I think this riffs through everything we've been saying so far, is that history and the experience of capitalism or socialism doesn't require that all societies go through the same pathway. That you can discover your journey, which is a word that he uses, and create your own history, your own way. And so the doubt is applied to received wisdom. So the stadial models of the Marxism that he was raised with in the 1930s, to the grand planners and modernization theorists who had all, Walt Rostow's stages. That you didn't have to fit the stages in order to construct your own history in some way. And that was liberating. In some way you could create your own history. So, and knowing you could do that could motivate you. So that turning the doubt from paralysis to motivation was key to this. And he was always aware that history making was one of that's what the development experience is really supposed to be. Start with that.
Yeah. Akabi, why don't I come to you? Doubt presumably could be a problem, a debilitating problem, when you've got to make these decisions in a very complex, resource-constrained context.
Yeah, it's in policy-making sphere, if we see, the main tendency is hesitation to act, not to take risks, because it's also linked with your political feature. So it's a big risk. So in terms of thinking, I feel even if a project fails, it's best to act and fail, because you will get lessons from that, and you will have an opportunity to find alternative solutions that are workable. But there is also some bridge I see that can narrow this possibility. As we know, in the Chinese tradition, especially the opening and reform, one of the key concepts of Deng Xiaoping is touching the stone to cross the river, or testing truths from facts. And this leads to the idea of experimentation. If we look in China, they act quite big, but before the big action comes always an experiment, a pilot, and also phasing. And in many of the projects in Ethiopia as well, we have been trying, or not because the Chinese did, but because our experience told us, we try to do a piloting. If we are starting 60,000 housing program, we started with 700 to make sure project can be completed in 6-7 months, and then get new lessons. And you don't also put all your apple in a basket. You try to do it also by phases, because every project is unique in its own. The political economy, the locality, all are quite different. So an element that succeeds a project in one place may not succeed in another. So a phased approach is also one possibility. But the basic concept is, in the academic world, for instance, one of the limitation is to look at too abstract level, which is not connected with the reality. And at the practitioners level also, they only try to learn from what they have gone through, and not try to link with new ideas, scientific lessons, or even lessons from others. So I think the issue of policy learning, the issue of piloting, the issue of experimenting is an important bridge to combine the concern, because everything can go wrong, but also the readiness to make adjustment as things evolve differently.
Thank you. John, do you want
to? Maybe going off on a tangent a little bit, but it's intransigent. I'm not that happy with characterizing Hirschman as anti-Marxist. I think he was certainly anti-Stalinist. He was certainly, and his experience in Spain would have reinforced that. If I understand it correctly, he was involved with him, and he was in some
he's more sympathetic to the anarchists.
Absolutely, in some expletive, deleted way, worked over by Stalinists. And I would have thought that that was a very important formation for him, and that subsequently any rigid formulae of a Stalinist kind he was very antithetical towards. But when I look at the way he argues and the way in which he expresses the need to make decisions as the outcome of conflict, it sounds, as though his early formation with Hegel and Marx was pretty much there.
I think you're absolutely right. In the sense that, let's say, the dialectical process is key, and not to be afraid of conflict, but to use it to move things forward. I think it's the capital H history of Marxism, of which Stalinism was one variant. So he was always very cautious about it. A number of claims, even among the non-Stalinist guys. But he was very. You're absolutely right. When he was young, I mean, he really did read the Social Democrats. This was what he imbibed. But he was not a Marxist, though, in the sense that social class for him was not a framework that he thought as particularly helpful. In fact, and it comes to doubt, because one of his skeptical points in his interventions very early on when he's in Colombia, the grand planners are coming down from Washington and talking to this Colombian government about the government doing this, that, and the other. And from his work with farmers, and that's the point about the banana, you notice, I don't know if anybody picked it up, but it's a banana. He's working with farmers in very local projects, saying that there is a private sector at work. People are making decisions, people are making investments. You're leaving the private sector out altogether, partly because this is where the Marxists and the grand planners agreed that the state was going to engineer development in some way, in this top-down. So very early on, he believed in bottom-up processes.
Good, thank you. I think we should open this up. I'm going to peek above the parapet of these computers. And so we'll take maybe 2 or 3 from here, and then with Enrico's help, we'll bring in if there are any online questions. You with your hand up there, please.
Yes, I have a question. Thank you so much for your presentation. I'm very curious. I was talking to a friend of mine who's also from Congo, from the DRC, and we were talking yesterday about how we don't trust our government, and that there is just this crisis of trust between the Congolese people and their government. And I don't think that if our government asked Congolese people to contribute to that project, that it would be as effective as it was in Ethiopia. I wonder how you dealt with the element of trust and really making sure that the citizens of Ethiopia actually trusted their finances to the government to actually build that project. I think it's a big crisis, I think, in a lot of places on the continent.
Thank you for that. Very, very good question. Any others? Laura.
I wonder if each of the speakers can talk about what makes them maybe optimistic and pessimistic when it comes to this, about the space to learn that policymakers are in, and the kind of possibility of being creative versus being under conditions or under, being robbed of that ability to be creative. So
not policy space, but learning space.
Yeah, like what makes you optimistic and pessimistic about the space to learn?
One more in here for now? Yes.
So I have a sort of a specific question, well, maybe related to what is mentioned here. When I was working in Malawi with the Ministry of Health there, my observation was that the capacity to take decisions within the Ministry of Health was somewhat challenged by the extensive amount of donor-led direction setting and the implementer partners who were quite territorial in sharing information and results and lessons learned. So in such a context, what sort of mechanism and incentives can the government set up to drive this culture of experimenting and learning, especially when resources and decisions are sometimes not in the hands of the government themselves?
Okay, thank you very much. Those are really lovely questions. Alkebe, would you like to start with the DRC question? Or any of those questions?
I'm not sure if I correctly listened to it.
So my understanding of your question is that, in Ethiopia, they built the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam from domestic resources. And it's a question really about how those resources were mobilized, I think.
Yes,
and the assumption is that that involves quite a lot of trust building between the implementing government and the people generating those resources.
Especially when you have Inga dam.
And that comes from Congo where the Inga 1, Inga 2, blah, 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 they take for years and years and still don't happen, and there's a different political context. So how did you bridge that in terms of resources and I think the politics of resource mobilization?
I believe it's context specific what has happened in relation to Grand Renaissance. It may not be universally applicable because a key element is building a consensus and matching what the government can do and also what the public will be willingly do. So the resource mobilization was done by a combination of various factors. First is the government has been investing in infrastructure for quite a long time as a key priority. So this means if we look at, on average, the gross capital formation in Africa, it's around 15%. In Ethiopia, the gross saving and gross capital formation for nearly 2 decades was 30%. So despite the country is poor, it has always put money for infrastructure programs, expansion of universities. So this is a key requirement because if there is no such situation where capital formation comes as a priority, which means you pay some price now in order to benefit in the future, then there is no ground to mobilize for such a big project. A second element also was, it was not only about money as well. It was about being able to do such a complex project. There has never been a project implemented in Africa that level of complexity. It's the biggest hydropower in the continent. And the government has been investing, expanding in hydropower from 100 megawatt to 500 megawatt, 1,000 megawatt, 2,000 megawatt. So the ability to manage the project was also gradually developing. Then when it comes to resource, the River Nile, as 84% of the water comes from Ethiopia, it has been an issue of national consensus across all national governments, starting from Emperor Haile Selassie, to see the hydropower as a national project. So it was a project that was continuously applied. And then you need to innovate, how do you mobilize the resource? So it was a combination of mobilizing from treasury, a big part, mobilizing from local banks, especially Development Bank, state-owned, and then also mobilizing by bringing Grand Renaissance Dam bond, where people can buy bonds, especially diaspora, and also mobilization from salaries and voluntarily. There were people who sold their houses and contributed to the project. So this is a combination of all these factors, and this context may not be present in many countries. It differs from situation to situation. And I believe a key element here is the ability to give priority to capital formation and the ability to believe in domestic resource mobilization. Because when you think about resource, we try to think about foreign aid. We try to think about grant. We try to think about loans from abroad. And one of the reasons for the public debt crisis in many African governments is the inability to mobilize domestic resources. And if we link it with Hirschman ideas, what Hirschman says is developing countries, what they have is scattered and a lot of resources which is scattered and wasted, but that can be used productively. So from a development policy perspective, we have to think how this can be achieved within the constraints.
That's a long, huge question that you asked. And obviously, you can take the discussion in other directions, and they hopefully will. Both the other questions had to do with decision-making capacity and ability and space for learning and creativity within government, particularly. I don't know whether John, you want to
just the questions of that kind. The foreign donors keep all the data, we can't take decisions, they keep key decisions to themselves. There's no policy space for many African countries because they have to do certain things because the IMF says they have to do them. The policy space for taking decisions is very, very limited. It's a standard line of argument amongst liberal left development economists. I think it also fits in with ignoring what Hirschman had to say about possibilism and being over-pessimistic. Yes, the negotiating power vis-à-vis Trump is really small, but things can be done, there are possibilities, there are possible paths. There's no reason for saying it'll never change. It may change. Things change in unexpected ways. And to build up a theory of external dominance, limiting possibilities for development decisions that make sense, feeds into a nationalist fever, which again, Hirschman had interesting things to say about, and may not be the best way forward. So I'm with Hirschman in saying, well, think about possibilities, be more open, don't think about how everything is in a circle, which means that in the end, poor developing countries have got no hope.
Do you want to add, Jeremy?
Just a few minor things. I mean, he was, and we're focusing on him, and I should just say, he got lots wrong. I mean, he there were limits to his theories. I think he'd be very uncomfortable with the lionizing sometimes. But he did have a concern with what he called the foreign expert syndrome. Right? That there was some knowledge out there that Ivy League institutions in Washington, multilaterals had, that local knowledge. This is why the thick description point, thinking about from the ground up what the knowledge foundations, and mobilizing them, and not having the skeptical attitude. He from very, very early on saw that dynamic at work and thought it was really a problem, and could generate self-fulfilling perverse outcomes, which goes back to the first question, which is about working in let's say low trust environments. He again his work in Latin America, for Colombia, he was doing all this work in the field during violent civil war. And one thing that grew out of that experience and through the 60s, 70s, and 80s, all the way through to his work on the return of democracy in Latin America was, this is what John is getting at, is don't get too caught up in your failurism, because it will blind you to see what actually might be going right, including among farmers who in the middle of the Civil War are doing very interesting things, and that trust reconstruction can come out of that. So, he had this term, he called it fracaso mania in Spanish, for, failurism. That these can become, kind of cognitive traps that low trust environments perpetuate. There's a temptation to be a little Pollyannish then to say, well, let's just kind of throw caution, to take risks or caution to the wind. And many people would accuse him of doing that. But what he was trying to do was to open up spaces, which goes to that the script is not written before humans take actions in some way. But so observation was a key word. I mean, we're being maybe a little repetitious here because it's what connects the praxis to the analysis. And he really was very concerned with creating the full 360-degree relationship with them. We could talk more about that, but he would never have imagined ideational activity being separate from how you do development on the ground.
Before I read a couple from online, can I just push you a little bit harder on Laura's question? Any of you about kind of now. You know, I think sort of, Laura's wondering, is there anything that makes you particularly pessimistic or optimistic or possibilist in any country, I guess, about that space for domestic decision-making creativity?
I have no answer.
Fine, that's
so I back out.
Well, I've been sort of very Pollyanna-ish, very optimistic, so let me say a few pessimistic things. I don't like the way in which the intellectual debate about economic policy has become dominated by people who don't understand Hirschman. And looking for the future, I think the number of people who are trained in the world, and I'm talking about people in India and people in Africa and people in Latin America who are trained in a very narrow orthodox development economics, is really dominating the field. So that makes me pessimistic.
Anything on that?
I think what John highlighted is I also share. In one way, again, the context is quite important. In some countries, I have seen where the government is not in a position to take any policy measure without consulting key donors or key governments which had historical links. But in a way, this does not convey that there is no policy space, because there is possibility in the broader debate of industrial policy. We know that industrial policy, for instance, was constrained by many of the rules of WTO. But we also know in all our researches, there is huge possibility and opportunity where governments can act and implement industrial policy in a way applicable in their political environment or in the way that reflects their situation. So let's look, for example, health sector. In many African countries, it's primarily donor-driven. Global Fund, for instance, is one major resource allocated. In that case situation, it will be impossible to develop, let's say, pharmaceutical industry, because the entire tender is managed in Washington and is not managed by respective Ministry of Health. But also we see, in a way, some of the recent developments, I see them a blessing. That the Trump administration has now ended assistance through USAID. In the short term, it may look painful, but in the long term, it's so important because African governments are now faced with a real choice to deliver and also to build on their domestic capability. So I feel there is a potential to use the available policy space, and that is even the bigger opportunity, I believe. And if we look also from Africa's perspective, I would say I feel more optimistic. If we look at the most recent developments, Africa is coming to the forefront as an important player. And this trend is going to continue because the global order is also shifting. So I feel there is also the condition for optimism for the continent to move beyond the current constraints is there.
That's a very Hirschmanian point. that when the Kennedy administration created USAID, they invited Hirschman to be its first director. And he said no because he was afraid it would be an organization that would impose agendas, have a script, go to the quote-unquote third world with ideas of how to do things, and he was opposed to that. So in some senses, yes, it kind of closes the circle.
These would be brilliant places to end, but we've got 5 minutes, and I do want to read out 2 questions from online. And if you can very briefly take these on. And the first is for Arkaby, from Cameron Goodman, and it says, could you address the issue of selecting projects with the strongest linkages? What are the linkages in this context, and how can we ensure we're addressing the right linkages without knowing everything that is to come? Do you want to just have a quick stab at that question?
Yeah, you better continue.
Oh, you want the other one as well? All right.
Yeah, so
okay.
that,
and the other from Sandy Johnston is, what would Albert Hirschman, this is for everybody, what would Albert Hirschman make of today's world and the political and technological disruption already apparent? What would his disruption response be? What learnings would he take from this? That's a very easy question. Anyway, really quick answers, and then we will wrap up.
yeah, on the projects I want to broaden it to sector selection, because linkage comes is central to selecting sectors or industries from an industrial policy perspective. And there is already some methodology and experience how you can look and study different sectors. For instance, when you select sectors, one key, I believe, foundational criteria should be the linkage effect, whether it has a strong linkage to, let's say, to other industries or for export, because it's the strength of the dynamism of this linkage that will really help us to drive more growth drivers. Second, could be based on the context. If it's a country that requires a lot of employment, employment is going to be a criteria. You cannot dismiss it. For Mauritius, employment may not be a big problem, but for Nigeria and Ethiopia, employment is quite critical. And third point, which I believe is essential, is the export potential. No country can survive without earning foreign exchange. Because if you see at the continent, many African countries are growing at 5 or 6 or 7%. But they have a big challenge not adequately generating foreign exchange, which is now bringing a much bigger macroeconomic crisis. So I think it can be this. There is already established some experience in this industrial policy framework.
Thank you. Any just final thoughts from the other two of you on the Hirschman in today's context?
I have to say something about linkages. I think it's a good question that was posed, because in fact it's extremely hard to measure linkages. And you can have input-output tables and the statistics, but I think the idea of linkages, the concept of linkages, is much more complicated than that, much richer than that. And for example, the question that was asked by the person from the Congo, Democratic Republic of the Congo, was about actually fiscal linkages. I mean, one of the implications of what Arkaby was saying about the dam in Ethiopia was that new forms of taxation were developed. Bonds were sold to the diaspora. These were completely, and apart from fiscal linkages, there are political linkages, which are quite complicated. And hard to measure or assess. Some people are going to gain and become more politically influential and powerful as a result of your project decision. That's a linkage. It's a key governance linkage issue. So in a way, this is a cop-out. It's too hard to answer the question, which projects linkages should you maximize? What you should do is be aware of the complexity and variety of different types of linkage when you are trying to make decisions about a project.
Yeah, I'll just to wrap it. I mean, I agree with complexity, and it's worth reminding ourselves that linkages, think about what that word means. It's about connectivity of phenomena. and hence the point of complexity. And there are many different kinds of linkages, in fact. There are forward linkages, there are backward linkages, there are demand-induced linkages. So it's a bundle. It's like property rights. It means different things, and so one would have to unbundle it to think about what your goals were. On what is this a genre of books? What would Jesus do? What would Obama do? Or what would Albert Hirschman do? I guess is the question. What he would feel, I think, is how would he would look at the world. Frankly, I think he would be somewhat dismayed. I'm sorry to say. That point at the end about intransigence is the word polarization didn't exist at that time, but the claim to rival truths and not listening to other sides, he would be appalled at the state of our civic discourse. And the pseudo-certainties that dominate the shouting, I think he would be depressed, honestly. And it would remind him of the early 30s.
There we go.
I'm sorry to end this way, but it was it's something that would occasionally come back to him throughout his life. If we slide back, it'll start with the quality of our discourse. And he would be very concerned.
I was about to say I'm sorry to end on that gloomy note, but I'm not. It's actually really important. It's a very, very important.
Well, he fought it.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, it doesn't mean you lie down, let it roll over you.
Exactly. So, on that note, I will thank you all for coming, and I'm sure, like me, you enjoyed that hugely, and that's thank you very much.